Good morning, this is Princen from XBOSoft. Thank you very much for joining. Today we're going to hold a webinar on how to make test automation work in Agile Development. And let me first explain you a little bit about the setup of the webinar. This is going to be an interactive webinar, so please ask all the questions you have. In the control panel from GoToMeeting, you can either raise your hand or type a question, and one of us will respond to that. We also will have a separate QA at the end of the webinar. Today we're very lucky to have two great speakers, Alan Tresker from XBOSoft and Mike Maheu from Go2Group. I'll let them introduce themselves. Mike, will you go ahead?
Hey everybody, how's it going?
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with Agile, Mike?
Sure. My experience goes pretty far back from the development side. I've been a director of development for several different companies and have integrated staff from QA departments into Agile teams, and changed a lot of the process, the traditional process of QA, into more of an Agile testing effort with the new teams.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And then we have Alan Tresker from XBOSoft on the line. Alan, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Alan? Oh, it seems as we have some issues with Alan's connection. Mike, I suggest we just go ahead, and if Alan dials in, we can let him join the rest of the conversation.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Agile and test, Mike. What are the differences?
Well, traditionally, and I'm going to kind of speak about three different types of testing. There's unit testing, which is done by developers, where they write test scripts basically for unit testing the software, and this can be obviously automatically done. It's typically done using TestNG or JUnit, depending on what you're developing. And then there's the traditional testing where there's human interaction and they're actually physically clicking through things or testing the application. And then there's the traditional test automation, which is done using things like Quick Test Pro and basically the QA staff spend a lot of time building scripts and building databases with test data and things like that. So there's a lot of upfront work, there's a lot of maintenance of the scripts. And those basically, when they execute those, they automatically go through and basically click on things and inject data to try and test all the aspects of the software. So, and we'll go on to the next slide, but traditionally, the way test automation works, it doesn't really fit very well in the Agile methodology. So that's mostly what I'm going to kind of try and compare and contrast of how to go from that traditional test automation to more of an Agile test automation.
And could you explain a little bit about the difference of tests in Agile compared to tests in a more traditional development method?
It's kind of a combination of things. Traditionally they call it test last automation because the developers would develop the software, and then at the end the QA folks would run all these scripts, and they would find all these problems and then dump all the bugs on the developers, and the developers would then go fix them, and then they would go back and they would adjust their scripts and they'd rerun their scripts. And obviously this is not that scenario kind of opens up a lot of room for missing deadlines doing that. So Agile obviously is test-driven development. It's test up front. It's not test last automation, but test up front automation. So the differences need to be done in how they write the scripts, and maybe even some of the way the tools that they're using in order to execute the scripts.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move forward to the next slide. Test automation. You started already here. What are some of the challenges, some of the objectives to automate? What different types of automation are there? And when should someone not automate their testing?
Sure. Well, definitely the challenges are going to be, like I said, there's there's a lot of maintenance with test automation scripts, and it takes, I've seen entire departments work long periods of time in order to prepare to execute a series of test automation scripts on a piece of software, and the reference that I'm using is actually a pretty large enterprise application. This is not a little web app. This is a for example a claims system or some sort of high transactional system that has a lot of business logic, and it takes a lot of testing time. And those projects, those types of projects, are challenges to even go into the Agile direction anyway. It always helps to kind of maybe break off some pieces of the development and create smaller Agile teams while perhaps a larger team moves on or moves forward with the bulk of the application. But there's the challenge is that they're going to have all of these scripts, and not only does it take a lot of time to maintain them and to create them, but it takes a long time for them to run. And so while all these things are running, everybody's kind of sitting there, and that is not Agile. Being in a co-located area and just sitting there waiting for a bunch of scripts to end and then to dump a bunch of work on you is not really Agile. So that's a challenge. The objective would be to break that up and to be able to break down the scripts almost like you're breaking down user stories, and break them into sections and be able to execute these scripts ahead of time. And so what that would mean is that you would modularize your scripts. So as the development occurs, because when we do Agile development, we're building little pieces at a time. For those scripts to be able to be executed on those little pieces of functionality at a time. So, for example, the login functionality was completed. That was a user story. They should be able to immediately execute, an automatic test the login. So there's a little bit of, obviously, it's not test last automation. It's test first automation is what we're talking about, and that's the difference. When should you not automate? Smaller projects. I could not see a reason why you would want to do this upfront work and create test automation up front and to do that due diligence, when in reality to test the functionality would not take very long to do so anyway. So for a small application where you log in and you post some blog posts and things like that, something simple, I don't think there's really a need for test automation in that case. Test automation is going to go ahead.
How would you measure size, Mike? Function points or team size working on it?
Not necessarily team size, because it could be a small team that's working on a piece of a complicated application, but complexity of the application. For example, if there's a lot of business logic, there's a lot of core transactional persistence type, a lot of data, complexity. I would think that would make more sense to have automation, because you're going to limit your defect generate. You're going to limit the number of defects and things like that, and you can kind of plan ahead to test these complex areas. Something that an individual or a QA person may miss. If there's a lot of complexity and a lot of layers, then it makes sense to have test automation. But for a smaller application where I log in and I create a blog post, it's not necessary.
Okay. And guys, let me remind you, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or type a question in the GoToMeeting box. Then we can direct it to Mike or Alan. Alan, are you there already? No, I don't think so. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Mike. The limitation of automated testing. What's your idea on this slide, Mike?
So from an Agile perspective, the limitation is going to be, are you spending more time building scripts? When we talk about capacity and velocity, if you're in your sprint period, you're spending most of your time building the test automation and then running the test automation, then you're getting results from it. In other words, when you're finishing your sprint, if there's really no more integrity or no less bugs, let's say, is it worth doing all the effort? Because if you think about it, if it's a 2-week sprint and they're spending 3 days trying to do test automation up front, but you're not really gaining anything that much from it when they could really just test the functionality in a single day over the, a certain number of hours over the 2-week sprint. That's going to be less than building all this test automation. Then it may not be worth it. So that would be a limitation, because obviously it's going to take more time. So you have to invest more time during the sprint in order to execute test automation.
And here you see automated testing juxtaposed against exploratory testing. How would this fit in an agile environment? Would there be a lot of exploratory testing there, or?
Right. So if you decided to not do test automation because there was a lot of upfront effort, and you could basically do exploratory testing and kind of, you could still write test scripts and execute them, using Bonfire or Synapse RT. You can create your test cases in Jira. You can create your test cases and run your test sessions in Bonfire. They're just not automatic. So I would call it exploratory testing. Even some of it may be, but you can lay out the agenda for testing. But you just got rid of all that up front. Let's run these scripts. There's a lot of maintenance with scripts. The scripts may break. You have to change the scripts every time you make a change in the development. So there's a lot of maintenance and upfront work in order to implement test automation in either, whether it's being agile or even another process. But that's you have to answer that question. Is it worth all of this time and effort that's going to be taken away from our capacity during our sprints? Are we going to benefit enough from it to go ahead and pay that tax?
So how do you do that? How do you decide if it's worth using the capacity for test automation or not, or utilizing it for something else?
There's some work up front. Even before you start sprints, you have to kind of look at the big picture and decide what is the total effort to generate this test automation. Are we going to use Selenium? Are we going to incorporate both? Because the cool thing about it is developers kind of become familiar. I call it, I've said in the past, cross-contamination of roles, but the developers are going to see, like, for example, if they're using Selenium, they're doing some test automation using Selenium. The developers are going to see this effort, and they're going to see how they're building these scripts. So they're going to learn from that. And of course, when the developers are developing their unit tests with TestNG or whatever, the QA folks are seeing that as well. So we're learning how both sides work together. And this is collaboration, so this is good. But before the sprints even start, everybody on the team, including developers, not just QA, they need to determine what the effort is going to be to build in this test automation. How many test scripts are we going to have to write using Selenium or whatever it is? And can we write these ahead of time, and can we kind of lay these things out before we even start the sprint as we're planning the backlog and things like that?
If you look at the image on the slide now, can you explain, do you have been in a situation where the increased effort, the hump, was larger than the saved effort? And can you explain the situation?
Right. That's exactly what I alluded to earlier. Is there is definitely going to be that hump, and you notice how the hump is at the beginning, which is better than being at the end. But there's definitely an initial effort to build this platform, or this series of test scripts that are going to be automated. Hopefully they're going to be able to be reused, but then there's the maintenance as well. So you can see how it plateaus above the initial effort, because even after you do the initial creation of all these scripts, there's still going to be some maintenance. And so this has to be, if you're going to incorporate test automation into an agile sprint process, it needs to be incorporated into the capacity planning. So.
And I know our listeners are interested in learning about best practices. And are there any signs or telltales when you can see at the beginning in the initial effort that this hump is going to be too high, too big?
It's kind of hard to say. Again, it depends on the application, the complexity of the application, how many test scripts are going to need to be created. Do you already have? Maybe you already have test scripts. Maybe you guys are moving from a waterfall process to an agile process. maybe you can take a series of the test scripts and modify them, and it's a smaller subset because we're breaking things into smaller pieces because maybe this agile team's just focused on UI, for example, or something. Then you can hopefully it's not a huge effort because you're not taking your entire group of test cases or test scripts, but you're taking a subset of them. But during the backlog planning, this is when these discussions need to happen. Maybe there's a couple of Scrum sessions prior to the actual sprint starting to where these things can kind of be worked out. But you want to think of the test scripts kind of as from an agile perspective, like almost like user stories. Is if you were going into a backlog of waterfall type requirements, you would be breaking these down into smaller pieces. So maybe a long test script that goes through and tests, all of the security. Maybe you would break that down into just some pieces that test, login and a couple of things that you need, and that needs to happen. It's kind of like planning a backlog almost.
Okay, and then complexity would be one of the things people have to look at in terms of when they decide to move forward with automation or not.
Yeah, complexity, and so far we've talked a lot about building the scripts and subsetting the scripts. But the other thing, I just was looking at the bottom of the slide that says time of execution. When I said break them down into smaller pieces, that also should be breaking down the time of execution. If it takes 3 days to run through these scripts, that's going to be a problem.
Okay, that's interesting.
And these should be executed as soon as they can be executed, because we don't want to wait. You never want to be in a sprint situation and be in any kind of waiting. There should not be anybody over there playing with the yo-yo because they're waiting on somebody else to do something. It should be an engine that's constantly going. So that you have to keep the engine, humming along at a certain RPM to meet your goal of your velocity and such. So.
I think we'll have a slide on the workflow later where you can talk a bit more on the time spent. Let's go to a statement. Graphical user interface, test automation, and Agile are a natural fit. Would you agree to this statement, or?
Not necessarily.
Why?
So, it kind of goes back to the things I've said already. I mean, if the effort is too great at the beginning for you, because obviously it takes a lot of work to build GUI test automation. If anybody's worked with, and I'm not a QTP or a Quick Test Pro expert at all, but I've had to wait for QA groups to build these scripts. They basically go off into a silo and they build this stuff, and they base these GUI test automation scripts. They base them on the requirements. In a classic scenario, they would get these large use cases or business design documents from the business, and they would go off into their silo and they would build these. They'd spend a long period of time building this test automation, this GUI test automation, with QTP, for example. And meanwhile, the developers are looking at these long use cases, and they're figuring out their design approach. They're doing, let's really go traditional, and let's say they're building class diagrams and use case realizations. They would go off and do that and do all their design. So we've got two different groups in silos doing two different things based off of the business. And obviously that is not Agile. That is completely waterfall or the rational unified process or the RUP process. So to make that Agile, this statement here, it doesn't really seem like that would fit. So how do we do that? Well, as I said earlier, you have to not go off on a silo, first of all, and when they build this test automation, they do it in collaboration with development, as the developers would build their unit tests in collaboration with the QA that are on the team. It's a team effort, and it's a cross-platform team effort. We've got QA, we've got developers, maybe we even have other folks on the team, but they need to break those down into small pieces and to minimize the effort up front to where it equals the benefit at the end.
We got a question in from Robert Masters, which kind of touched what you've been talking about, and he is asking, how can you automate a test script up front for code that hasn't been built yet?
That's a good question. So basically, if you think about with the example that I just gave, when they're building their test scripts, they're building them based off of requirements. The developers haven't really developed any code yet, and it's true that they will adjust these scripts based on the results of what they get delivered into the QA environment or whatever. But breaking it down, breaking it into smaller pieces, if we have mock-ups or some screen designs, they can develop these scripts more on the fly. So they're not going off into a silo and looking at the requirements and looking at mock-ups from the business, but they're collaborating with the team, and maybe they're generating mock-ups early on in the sprint, and they're able to build these test scripts before the actual development is completed. In other words, while the developers are building the logon and they're building the screen that has the user ID and password functionality, they're building the scripts to execute against those fields and the data, because they already know what the database is going to look like at that point. So it's it's on the fly more than it is. And if you think of it traditionally, there were always problems with the scripts. There's more maintenance and there's more changes. They're executing a lot more scripts and a lot more complex scripts all at once. Here we're going to do smaller bits and pieces, and we're going to develop them on the fly. Hopefully we'll be able to reuse them, as the application matures across sprints or iterations.
Okay, thanks. Robert, I hope this answers your questions. If not, please type in follow-up questions, then we can handle it as well. Okay, let's move to the next slide. You already talked a little bit about agile teams versus waterfall teams, silos, and working in groups. Who do you think should be responsible for test automation in an agile team?
So, yeah, and definitely, as my previous example, it typically is a silo situation. That's the cool thing about Agile, and that's why it works, because it is, in the past, QA folks didn't really understand unit tests and what happened and what the results look like, and developers never looked at QTP results or Selenium results and how they got reported. They just see the bug show up in the issue tracking system. So this collaboration is going to basically produce more knowledge on both sides, so the folks on both sides learn from each other. And I think that over the sprints, they're going to be able to work closer and be more productive, and kind of almost be able to see things coming that they might not have been able to see before. I actually coined a couple of things in a previous position where the first thing that I wanted is I wanted the QA folks to, because this is before we actually had a co-located situation, I wanted the QA folks to see how the unit tests were developed and when they were run, how they would execute and what the results would be. So I coined this thing called collaborative unit testing, and then everybody started calling it CUT. But they would set up sessions with the QA person that was going to be designated for the team, and the next thing you know, I'm walking around and I see a QA person sitting in a developer's cube, and they're running unit tests. And that started getting that excited me, because I was like, this is, wow, you don't normally see that. You don't normally see a QA person actually working with a developer like that. So.
And how about the skill set required? Did you have any issues there where maybe the QA people were more skilled on a functional level? Did you overcome that, or do you think that's just a benefit for letting people do both things?
Yeah, it's definitely there's some trickiness to determining teams, and the people that go on the teams. There's a lot of factors. There's personality factors, and from my side, being the guy looking across all of these different people that work for me, I knew the personalities, and I kind of figured that I could kind of pair certain people. Now, that personalities is one thing, but I also need the right expertise on the right teams, right? So it's not going to be perfect, especially at the beginning. But again, this cross-contamination, and that's a joke, I call it cross-contamination. They're going to contaminate each other with each other's experience, and they're going to learn from each other. And I call that team dynamics. They're going to build, the team dynamics is going to improve over time. And this is natural. Their capacity is going to increase a little bit, and their velocity is going to increase as they learn from each other, and they become more efficient.
And Mike, what are your ideas on, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I still want to ask because I know many teams are working this way, where you would have an Agile Development and QA team, but a separate GUI automation team for the regression testing. What are your ideas on setting it up that way?
Sure. As long as, because we definitely we like continuous integration, and another thing that we like is we like automatic smoke testing. So as the sprint team is developing, and let's say that they're doing some test automation during the sprint, and they're also doing some manual testing or whatever, there's also this continuous integration happening that's doing the builds and deploying it to the server, which is what they're actually testing on. So the team that is off building for example, the regression testing, or even that, like I said, the smoke testing, that's great, because that doesn't affect the velocity or the speed or the capacity of the team that's actually working on the sprint, as long as it doesn't hinder them from doing their work. In other words, if they run a bunch of scripts that possibly are not quite cohesive with what the effort is of that particular sprint, and it generates a bunch of problems that maybe are not quite as they're not pertinent to what's happening, that would be a problem. But I've actually done this before, where the automation team had developed smoke test scripts and some regression of the basic functionality of the application. Of course, this is after we've gone through sprints where we have something that can be smoke tested. And they would execute these, and it would automatically generate the reports, and it would then email out the results on a daily basis. They would basically do a nightly regression test on the continuous integration server, and it would mail out the results to the sprint team, and it worked out great.
So you say you're okay with separating the team as long as it doesn't interfere with the velocity, the speed of the work.
Right. Well, this team that I'm talking about that's doing the automation for the smoke testing or regression testing, they're not on the sprint team.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah.
They're like a build engineer that's just kind of, facilitating things for the sprint team. Yeah.
But you're okay with it as long as they don't interfere with the speed of the sprint team, right?
Correct.
Okay. Interesting. The next slide on tools. To make test automation work in an agile environment, we need a different tool set than we would need to make test automation work using traditional development methods. What's your take on this, Mike?
Yeah, there's not a lot out there, because if you were actually going to, I guess, and I don't want to bash on products, but QTP is not really an agile product. It's a very expensive product as well, but if they're going to continue to use QTP, they obviously, like I said earlier, they're going to have to break it down into smaller pieces. Now Selenium is and I'm not that familiar with Selenium, but I just know that it's gained in popularity. It's kind of a web testing framework that's open source, and you can write scripts and things. And I think that would be a more popular product for agile test automation. And then, of course, we still have the developers, and because unit testing is test automation too. It's just automatically executing code and injecting data, but it's not necessarily testing the UI. So a combination of maybe Selenium and TestNG or JUnit would be good.
Okay, there's another question coming in from Prida Nair. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. And she or he is asking, there's a lot of maintenance required in automation. How many automation engineers would you recommend for an agile group?
Right. Typical agile teams that I've seen range from 3 to 6 people. and there's many, and there could be multiple teams, and maybe even there's Team X, Team Y, and Team Z, and they're working on the same application. But the teams themselves are typically between 3 and 6 people. And normally that's a breakdown of 2 to 3 developers to 1 to 2 QA. So it makes sense to me.
Prida says they have an 8-person team.
Okay. It makes sense to me, and this is just my opinion, that perhaps during the initial planning and things like that, you would have maybe one, or in your case, maybe 1 or 2 designated test automation folks, and then the other 1 or 2 QA folks could work on the traditional other testing methodologies that you have.
And the other 4?
It's just the other 4 are probably going to be developers, which are going to be doing test-driven development, hopefully, and they're writing their unit tests. So, and that's the way it should work. If you can have that happening, where you're having the developers writing test-ng scripts, and you're having 2 QA folks kind of planning the attack on how they're going to test this thing from a UI perspective, and then you have a couple of test automation folks, then that might work out well.
Okay. Do you want to say more about the tools, the different tools for an Agile environment, or?
I mentioned Selenium. That's a good one. The other interesting aspect to this is, if you're going to write scripts, most of these applications that we work with or that are in development these days have, they have a RESTful service or some sort of web service. So you certainly could use that to have your scripts inject data and try to put a number in an alpha field or something like that. But usually that's going to be done with a unit test. But you certainly could. I guess what I'm saying is you could write your own homegrown scripts for test automation as well. But the popular ones that I know of today are test-ng for unit testing. Obviously, JUnit's been around forever. Selenium. And I mentioned web services and SOAP UIs. JMeter is another load testing application. I guess there's something called Fitness or Fitnesse, which is a wiki-based automation, and then there's QTP and Load Runner and those things. Those are all the ones that I'm familiar with. But
Francesco is asking if you could specifically repeat the open source tools that you've mentioned.
Selenium is actually open source. Selenium is an open source automated web testing framework, and it's spelled SELENIUM.
Okay. I asked Prida what was the composition of her team, and from the 8 people on their team, they have 5 developers, 1 automation engineer, and 2 QA manual.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, let's move forward to the next slide. Test and development integration. This is a large one. How does everyone work together, and what do we do with the test reports?
Right. Well, that's the cool thing, about Agile as well, is there's no QA testing at the end and then throwing stuff back to developers at the end. Because, if our deadline is Friday, and, it's classic and everybody's familiar with this. First of all, the developers go longer than they're supposed to. So now the QA have to double time it. And then when they do their double timing it, they also find a bunch of problems, and then that goes back on development. And it's this cyclical thing that is classic, and everybody's been there, and you always miss deadlines. So doing things up front and having everybody collaborating in the same zone, we alleviate from those things happening. But as we've said all along, test automation and even regular Agile testing needs to be planned out up front, but in smaller pieces, so it doesn't take as much effort as it would if you were testing an entire application that had been in development for 2 months, because we're working with smaller pieces of the application. Then the upfront effort decreases, and you can actually be more focused on these particular pieces of the software. So it's not like, when you're it's like when you take on any task and you look at, a huge mess. Say, for example, you're looking at a house that has the entire house is a mess. Instead of looking at the entire house, just go into each room and work on each room at a time, and then it doesn't seem as daunting as the entire house. Same thing with this. We're not looking at the entire application. We're looking at security, or we're looking at whatever is in this particular sprint, and we're breaking it down into pieces, which is going to decrease the initial effort, but also allow us to focus on that more intensely.
Okay, we got a question from Sandami Luke, and we got a couple other questions on tools I will ask later. But Sandami is asking, regarding web services testing, who should define the integration testing phase? Devs, the technical QAs, or jointly, Mike?
Yeah, definitely jointly. I always stress jointly all the time, because there's no reason, and a lot of, I work with a lot of companies that still insist on measuring individual people on the team. They want to look at how much effort is it for John, and how much effort and it's not important, because we want to measure the team as a whole. And when I talk about team dynamics, and I talk about, we're not building a team around John, we're building a team around everybody on the team, and we're measuring how the team functions as a whole, as a single unit. I was about to quote a movie that was a really cheesy movie from the 80s, but there was this movie called Band of the Hand, The Fingers of the Hand. And it's like, all of the fingers have to work together on the hand.
Mike, we had such a good impression of you.
And that's, so as we learn from each other and as we build, go ahead.
No, sorry, please continue.
What was that?
We had such a good impression of you before you started quoting movies from the 80s.
Yeah. But obviously we're going to learn from each other. So, up front, and having everybody learn from each other, and having everybody do other things. And they say this enough, if you look at any Agile book, they'll say that after a while, what would be the problem, or what would be wrong with a QA person actually coding? And that there's no issue with that. And at first, developers are like, there's no way that person's going to be able to code. They're not a developer. It takes years. And that's true. But after being on a sprint team and learning from developers, you'd be surprised at how different people start to dynamically build their expertise. And so now we're not isolating people into QA silos and development silos, and everybody's working together to build software. And it allows everybody to be more creative as well. It's more exciting.
Can you explain about a particular case, about this learning curve? How fast you see QA people getting up to speed to development? Are we thinking months or years or days? Oh,
definitely months. Maybe even a month or 2 months with some aspects of it, for sure. Yeah, and I've seen this with a very complicated application. An application that had a ton of business logic and persistence, and a lot of complicated service layers and things like that. And not to mention that during the development of this product, from an Agile side, there was a major refactoring going on. So they were not only fixing things and developing new functionality, but they were doing it based on a new platform. For example, migrating from a legacy persistence layer to Spring MVC, or that was actually what they were doing. So, classically, the QA folks would have no idea what Spring MVC was or what it did. They would not understand really what what the JSP was doing in comparison to what the service layer was doing, and that kind of thing. But once these teams were formed and they started working together, they learned what these how the architecture of the application was laid out, how how it was being implemented. They obviously, typically QA folks are familiar with the database because they know the data. They know what test data they need, and they get familiar with tables and things like that. But they're not really that familiar with anything other than that, and then the UI that is looking at them when they test. But bringing them onto a sprint team, they start to learn the architecture. They start to learn especially when they watch unit tests being executed, they can see the fields and how they map the data to the forms or the web pages and things like that. So once they start learning that and they start looking at, I've actually seen it to where QA folks are writing unit tests. That's probably the first thing that happens, is they can start writing unit tests. So you'll see a QA person eventually, possibly in Eclipse or something like that, writing a JUnit or a TestNG unit test.
I got a question from Robert Masters on the workflow, and he excused himself. It's a bit off topic, but I think it will be interesting for the other listeners as well. In Agile teams, is there any role for business analysts, Mike? Should they be used or should they not be used?
That's an interesting question, and because if we think about Scrum, we have product owners, right? Which the product owners could be project managers from the past, or it could be business analysts and things like that. And then we have our Scrum Master. Typically, those people are not on the teams themselves, but there are cases where I've had, for example, impact areas. When I explained earlier how there's a refactoring project going on, which is kind of they're refactoring the legacy aspect of this large application, and then you have these agile teams that are building new functionality and new UI as the refactoring occurs. So when you have those multiple efforts and those multiple swim lanes happening, and there's different pieces of this software being released at certain points, there's impact areas. For example, they could be working, the sprint team could be working on a security aspect, but at the same time they're refactoring something in security. So we need to make sure that the sprint team uses the new version of the security module and not the legacy one, and so on. So there's definitely some merging and branching and trickery with the build guys, but there's impact areas. And in order to determine those impact areas, it typically takes an individual that is familiar with what's going on in the refactoring aspect and what's going on with the agile aspect. And in my case, I had one of those experts that this guy knew everything about the entire application. He was the most familiar with it. He had worked with it the most. And so what he was is he would come to the Scrum sessions and he would kind of listen to what was happening, didn't do a lot of talking unless there seemed to be an impact area that was going to be there, and then that would be discussed. But you could do the same thing with, maybe that impact area is from a business perspective. And this particular guy that I'm using as an example was a dev lead, but you could certainly have a person like that would be at these Scrum sessions that could designate or not designate, but look at impact areas or make sure that business was the business aspect was being dealt with.
Okay, thanks. I got it.
But not on the team from a day-to-day basis. I wouldn't recommend that.
I got a quick question from Francisco. Regarding Selenium, is there an IE browser equivalent?
That's a good question. The only one that you could look at that fits, and I'm not sure if I'm saying this correct, Fitness. It depends on your application type, but there's something called Fitnesse, Fitnessee, which is a web-based automation framework.
Okay. Mike, next up is a slide you made, and it's on a workflow. Could you explain a bit what we're looking at?
Sure. So, one of the things that we talk about test automation, but within your issue tracking system, Jira. In this example, we have set up workflows specific for testing. And in this case, this workflow is based off of a plugin that we at Go2Group developed for testing inside of Jira. It's called Synapse RT. And this allows you to create test cases and basically run these test cases through this workflow that you see here. So as you create test cases, you can actually create groups of test cases. We call them test suites. And you can do all of this with inside Jira, the issue tracking system. And you can also, as you execute these test cases, and again, this is not automatic, this is not automation, but as you run through the test cases or run through the steps of the test case, you would move it through this workflow. And as, for example, if something failed, you would say it failed, and the test case would be in a failed state, and then you could actually create a bug within Jira and link that bug to this test case. And so now we start to see traceability. So we're not actually executing an automation test, but we're almost there because we did go through a series of steps, which is what the automation test would do. It would go through a series of steps in the test. So we're able to build test cases and go through the series of steps, whether we use Bonfire or just a web browser or whatever, even if it's a client-side application, maybe it's a client-based application. We'd be able to then document the results of the steps within these test cases using Synapse. And that's as close to automation as you can get using Jira, the issue tracking system, without actually executing some automated script.
Mike, you attracted quite some interest. There a couple of questions came in. Could you repeat the name of the Jira plugin?
Sure, it's called Synapse RT, S-Y-N-A-P-S-E, and then a capital RT, and it's the reason why we developed this plugin is because we also have a plugin called Jam that synchronizes Quality Center with Jira. But we had a lot of requests several years ago where they wanted to be able to do tests within Jira because they love Jira, the issue tracking system. So my idea was to build Synapse RT to allow them to basically do what they do in Quality Center via a plugin. And so we have issue types that are called test cases, and we actually have issue types. And again, you can name these as you please. It's totally configurable. But also, you can create test plans or test runs, if you call it a test run or a test plan. And that would be a series of test cases that you can, again, run through this workflow within Jira, and then you can see the results. There's actually a traceability matrix that will show you the stories and the epics and the test cases that were executed and whether they passed or failed and whether any bugs were generated. So it's as good as it gets inside of Jira, and it's what I call an all-inclusive sandals resort for testing and issue tracking.
Mike, since we're talking about Jira and Quality Center, Bay Melamed has a question, and he's asking you, what do you think of Microsoft Visual Studio 2010 and their testing and automation tools?
I'm not that familiar with their testing automation tools, but I am very impressed with Microsoft lately, and I'm actually impressed with the way they're kind of branching out. They're all of the tools, Visual Studio, they've got I believe it's called, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's called Team Foundation Server, that has the source code repository integration. It's got the obviously you have unit testing and now test automation, and now they even have Azure, which is this huge cloud platform. So essentially you can build not just .NET applications with these tools, but you can build PHP applications, Ruby applications, even Java applications, and deploy these to their Azure cloud service like you would Amazon or anything else, or Heroku. And they're covering all the bases, and these tools are not expensive like they used to be. They even have free versions of all these tools. So I'm very impressed with Microsoft, and you're going to see. I think they're doing the right thing now, and they even support Linux in their cloud services. And as a matter of fact, if anybody's an Apple fan and they use their new iCloud stuff, that's all hosted in their new data center, and it's all running on Azure. So you're gonna see a lot of Microsoft stuff coming up, and more people are going to be using it. It's good stuff.
Okay, great. Let's move to the next slide. We're almost at the end. And let me remind you guys, you can ask questions. If you want, we can also open the mic. Just raise your hand or type a question in the Go2 meeting box. Mike, we got a question before from Sirisha Godem Beckham. And he or she is asking if you could give more details on how to build automation scripts before development finishes. For example, how would I know the element IDs, CSS paths, etc.?
Sure. Again, it's kind of like an on-the-fly situation. So you're going to have to, you would be building your test automation during, and let's just pretend that we have a sprint that's, but the sprint has a couple of iterations, right? So there's a couple of iterations that are going to occur as you build the foundation, and then you're actually, these are not releasable. So that's, that's the reason for the iterations, and then you're going to release the final sprint. The test automation, and this slide makes sense because this is kind of what we're talking about. But as you're building writing these scripts, you're going to be building them in at the same time that the developers are building the unit test scripts. So you may not have the element IDs of the select lists and things like that at that point, but you can build out the framework for this, and then of course that's what they're doing with the unit test scripts, and then as they execute those against the classes that develop, for example, the business objects and things like that that are going to hold the data, and then they start building out the select lists and the forms, then you can just simply go back to your test automation and fill in those IDs for the values that are mapped to the select lists and whatnot. So it's kind of an iterative process of building these scripts. You would build them over these iterations, and then you would execute them as soon as they were able to be executed against the code as it was completed. So it's a little different than building the scripts all up front based on an existing application. And again, it depends. Maybe there is an existing application. Maybe you already do have the IDs. It just depends. But there's no problem with measuring the capacity of building the test automation on the fly throughout the iterations.
Okay, I'll ask Sirisha if this answers his or her questions. We got a couple of questions before the webinar started via email, and one of the questions you always get or often get with automation: what type of coverage should I typically aim for? What percentage of cases should be automated?
Yeah, definitely not 100%. It's a balance of your capacity planning and meeting your sprint. Now, and again, we don't want to take away from what we want to be able to consume from a number of stories perspective, or a number of stories and bugs. So if we have to decrease our maybe increase our capacity just a little bit, but decrease our velocity just a little bit to bring in automation, that's great. So maybe it's kind of like as you do capacity planning and you go over sprints and iterations over time, you kind of you start to build and see the trends, and it's gonna be the same with test automation. You want to start out small, maybe just focusing on 30% or 40%, and take it from there, and then if that works out, then maybe you can increase a little bit. And then don't forget, when we talk about regression and smoke testing automation, sometimes you can extract that out of the team and actually have somebody else working on that, and they're just focused on that being executed against the base foundational logic of the application on the continuous integration server.
Okay, and how do I convince my boss to move to test automation or agile development?
That's probably the hardest question of all. Well, usually there's more than one boss, and usually the way agile starts is it starts in the from the development side. They always try to pick the real savvy tools and use all the latest stuff. The trick is convincing the business and the bosses, and even sometimes the QA folks, how this is going to work. And it really, you know, it really takes an evangelist within your organization. It takes somebody that is going to go out and do due diligence and research how this transition can occur. It also, I see a lot of companies with one foot in and one foot out, and you know, it works a little bit, but it doesn't work a lot. It's not, if you're going to do it, you really want to cover all the bases. And the easiest way that I've seen this done in an organization that is traditionally waterfall and that is embedded in it, and you know, they can't really turn on a dime because they have to get things out. They have to have their releases going out because, you know, maybe they're mandated legally, or they have to make changes to accounting or banking things. Those are tough. So what the easiest low-hanging fruit to do, and this is what I've done in the past, is I say, look, you have all of these bugs in your, and we'll call it a quote-unquote backlog for now, but they don't call it that. And these bugs are not being addressed. Maybe there are bugs that have been sitting there for a year, or for 2 years, or for 3 years, and they're not being put into production. And why are they not being put into production? Because they don't have time to address them, because they're constantly doing these releases, and they're always in the weeds, and they're doing new functionality, and they're, you know, fixing the items that are serious. So why not build a team that is not going to be intrusive to the normal waterfall process, and have this team focus on this backlog of bugs, these font problems, these misspellings, these little things, and start to work the process with that. Because it's not going to merge and branch font changes and simple bugs that just have not been addressed into the main line is not going to be as complex as it is working on, you know, the persistence layer or security or anything like that. And so what that does is it allows them to see a low-risk effort. There's not a lot of risk there, but we can start to practice the process. And when we practice the process, we practice it from top to bottom, from business to Scrum Master to product owner to developer and QA to co-location to delivery.
Mike, we're almost at the end of the time, and I'm going to give one more question. All other questions will be answered by email later. But Bay Melamed is asking you if you know any automation tool vendor that uses their product to test their own product.
Sorry, I'm not sure I get the question. Go ahead.
Any tool vendor that uses their own product to test their product, if they eat their own dog shit.
Oh. There's, you know, if we look at Atlassian as an example, they're big test automation guys, but not test automation like we're talking about today. They have test coverage from their unit tests that they say meets like high percentage, like 98, 99%. So they have very few QA staff on their Agile teams. That's the extreme end of one example. But I'm not sure of a company that actually, you know, Selenium is open source. We use Synapse. Go2Group uses Synapse, so we eat our own stuff.
Okay, Mike, well, thank you very much. Go2Group and XBOSoft have a service together which is called Agile Automation Assessment. If you would like Mike or Alan, who sadly couldn't make it, to look at what you guys are doing and help you set up an efficient workflow between developers and QA and check if you can automate part of your testing, please reach out at the URL that's on the page now. It will also be sent to you via email after the webinar. And furthermore, if you'd like to contact any of us directly, you can reach Alan at services@XBOSoft and Mike at sales@go2group.com. And thank you very much. Mike, do you want to add something?
Just appreciate everybody showing up, and I hope to meet some of you guys someday and maybe answer some questions at a conference or something. Thanks.
Yeah, and we'll have another webinar coming up while you get via email, but with all the vacation, we still have to schedule it when all of us can make it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.